Hi, Roland. It's good to see you. I'm looking
Hey, Chap.
forward to continuing this conversation.
I am too. I love being with you last time, and this is always such a refreshing process for me.
It is. I've got my coffee. I'm ready to go.
All right, awesome. I have my coffee too, and tasting good. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, no, I think that we really got to a fun place last week, and as difficult as it is when you're sitting around together in a group and chatting, to think of that necessarily as fun, because we tend to move into this place of getting it right. Our hope is that the joy of us having this conversation and the discovery that we're going through will initiate conversation amongst a group or thoughts for an individual, but help the engagement of their own discipleship journey. So this is not about study, facts, questions, answers. It's about conversation, and we would love for people to be able to enjoy conversation in this place.
Yes, there are no right answers, right? It's just good discussion.
Right. And certainly that's true when we are talking about how God's grace impacts our lives, because how God's grace impacts our lives and our own personal misunderstandings are the issue that we're dealing with, right? Or our failures or our fears or whatever. And God's grace and opportunity and optimism and how that encounters us. So that's the framework we're trying to create, which can be a different model, and sometimes it can be uncomfortable, and even someone trying to take what we're doing and lead a study group may feel like it'd be helpful to have questions that they could talk to. So what we will do is put up a series of slides that will have questions that might engage a conversation. There's no need for anyone to do those specifically, but if you're looking for a conversation starter, that's where you'll find it. But this is about the conversation, and if we as a group of people spend an hour together, just chatting, having a conversation that's initiated by these thoughts, that will be success, right? Because it's about the long haul, and we hope that you and I are still having this conversation 10 years from now. But that is also true from anybody that might be engaged in this process with us. And the truth is, if we get this right, then the capturing of ideas and understandings is representative of that long, slow journey together, not the right answers.
Right. It would be interesting even 5, 10 years from now for us to do this again to see how we've changed and progressed in this
Oh,
journey, right?
yeah,
Because
that'd be awesome to reflect on.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
because
and
we're
that
all
kind
in
of
process, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's right. Exactly. And because we're constantly pushed towards wanting to be able to say we've got it right. And we talked about a little bit about that last time. But these we look for these high moments that define the fact that we've been successful. And
Yes.
this process is to not to deny the validity of high moments, encounter with God. They are wonderful and to be enjoyed. And when you're in those moments, embrace them with everything you've got. But that's not the end of the thing. It's not all of it. It doesn't capture everything that God is doing. And we can't make it about that.
Yeah. We had being here at Asbury, we just went through, I guess it's been 2 years ago now. It's crazy that it's been that long. But we went through the great outpouring, the outpouring of
I
of the
remember
Spirit,
that.
right? The revival, almost 3 weeks long. And
Amazing. I remember
oh,
how that was all over the place. Yeah.
it was such an incredible experience. I mean, one of those once in a lifetime encounters with God's presence, and people were changed, like deeply, deeply changed. And I was too, like my encounter with God, very, very personal, very meaningful to me. Um, and I'm so thankful for that. Like I do think that those moments matter. They're important, right? It's important to be there and it's important to be part of that. I think what's been interesting though, as we've moved away from that time, is to see how quickly so many of the Christians and the churches around here have started going, okay, God, do it again. It's like, whoa, whoa, slow down. We just had this incredible experience, and now we want it again. So instead of living in this place of gratitude or living in this place, how has God worked? It's like we immediately want the high again, right? We
Exactly.
want to move from high to high instead of being in those quiet seasons of faith.
Yeah.
And it's just made me really wonder about those quiet seasons of faith and how important they are for our
Why?
spiritual process, our spiritual journey.
That's where we tend to live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really important idea to grasp, particularly for those immersed in understanding in our theological tradition, the Wesleyan holiness tradition. We kind of focus on what we call crisis experience to try to emphasize the dramatic momentariness of that. And so we talk about these particular two crisis experience, and one is salvation and the other is entire sanctification. But we focus so much on this experience that once you've had captured those two experiences, you've got it all. So there is nothing to go back to, right? There's only just moments of euphoric encounter, but there's nothing dramatic and wonderful. We've had them, right? So the rest of Christian experience is static, except for wonderful moments, right? And that diminishes both the reality of this of what we call the static and the value of superbly embraced moments of encounter with
Yeah.
God. We miss the fact that because God is God, whatever I'm doing right now, which for us happens to be this wonderful conversation, but in a few minutes from now, we'll move into very practical moments. But God is equally engaged with us now in this conversation and what we'll be doing next in our day. And being able to recognize that God is constantly working in the background doesn't mean that God's manipulating and controlling and pushing towards some destiny, but that idea of grace is continuously there with us.
You're talking, I'm thinking about Abraham, right? Where scripture tells us of these moments, these encounters he has with God when God pronounces this blessing, right? This covenant with him. But then there are 25 years
Right,
between those.
right,
And would we think God wasn't with Abraham? God wasn't, his grace wasn't active? No, of course it was,
right,
right?
exactly. And that's
Yeah.
what's remarkable about this book, actually, because the big books, the books that get people's attention, tend to be descriptive of those high experiences. And so we're going, I want that's what I want. Give me the book that tells me how to get there, and I'll do what the book says, and I'll get there. But he's talking about the reality of the mundane journey that we're in, and that each moment we're engaging in this spiritual process. And so recognizing that God is there with us becomes very, very important. In fact, as we look at this first chapter, we'd like to encourage everyone to make sure you read that first chapter. It is a continuation of where we were last time in the prologue and introduction, but it highlights the enormity of the individual choices that we're making, and it puts it in very stark terms. And there's this quote from C.S. Lewis in the middle of it. And it could be easy for a person to read that and say, oh, that's not true. It's not that significant, because he does use this we're either choosing to go towards the darker space or we're choosing towards to go for the light. And I think it's important to recognize that actually that's true, that choices in a moment make for our reality.
They really do. Yeah. I think the language he uses is that you're either turning into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature.
Yeah, it's pretty dark.
Ooh,
Or
it's a
it's
little scary, right?
it is scary, right? Exactly. That was my reaction to it.
If I eat this piece of chocolate, which way am I going?
Right, right, right. And that's not what he's trying to get at, right? But he is trying to raise the significance of our engagement with the moments as
Yeah.
opposed to just waiting around for something big that's going to happen, right? Uh,
So where I have seen this practically, probably is going to be weird because I don't know that everybody knows this about me, but I used to work in the prison system as a psychologist, and I did maximum security for a while. I did forensic assessment. So I've worked with pe some people who have done some pretty unspeakable things, actually. And one of the models that we talk about all the time in forensic psychology is something we call the rational choice model.
Mm.
And essentially, what we say is people don't wake up one day and they say, I'm going to be a murderer, or I'm going to be a bank robber, or I'm going to be a drug addict and I'm going to sell drugs and get all these people. They don't wake up and just say, I'm going to do this, right? But what happens is that over the years, they make this series of very small choices that then committing this crime is actually just the next small choice. It's not a big choice,
Right,
it's just the next
right,
tiny
right.
choice in that journey.
Yeah.
Um, and as I thought about that, I began to think about what about my own life? Like, what are the little choices that I'm making? And if I think about the exponential growth of those, where is that going to take me? Right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I do know that about your life journey, Janet, because you shared that with me before, but I guess I don't really, unless I force myself to think about the dramatic representation of that truth to you, the way you've seen that truth. And that, if there's one thing I love about you and about our relationship, it's the way that you are actively evaluating how you are experiencing the moments. I see that all the time, and I love that. And it's not always easy. In fact, there are times that very process becomes complicated. But I love how honest and vulnerable you are in that. It's a joy in our journey.
Thank you. I mean, you sit in the room with these people, some of these, and I particularly worked with men, and some of them did horrible things,
Mm,
but they were a kid like I was, and they had parents like I did, and they have family that they love like I do, and they had hurts along the way like I've had. They are human and they are loved by God just like I am. And if they can make a series of choices that go so poorly,
mm,
then isn't the same true for me?
right. Yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah.
how do I look at myself honestly and say,
Yeah.
what are my choices and where are they headed?
So, do you think there's a framework or a way of thinking about the little choices, the insignificant, the ordinary, that helps us with that?
Um, I I mean, as I think about it in the context of what we're studying, right? I'm
Mhm.
thinking about, am I turning toward God or am I turning away from God?
Right.
Am I turning towards surrender to grace? Am I turning towards self-control?
Hmm.
Am I turning toward love for others or am I turning away or turning toward using others, right?
Mm,
And
right.
it, I think it's that constant in every situation. What's the choice that I'm making?
Right.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Like,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah,
If I think you and I are both inflicted with the capacity to be very focused on how we're experiencing the moments, right? I think
yeah.
we are.
That's why we get
I
along
have
so well.
conversations with people and they're surprised that I've thought so deeply about the fact that I'm eating, I'm buttering my toast, about that, which reflects my ability to analyze things to the nth degree. Not
And
everyone's
today I have
afflicted in that
grief.
way. Was there?
I was saying today I have grief because we're cutting down one of our trees and I had to go say goodbye to the tree.
Right, right, right. And so there's advantages and disadvantages for sure to that approach to life, but there is a way, I think, of finding a middle ground in that appreciates the significance of the ordinary moments that we live, and they aren't just moments. There is a spirit, as we spoke about last time. There is a spirituality to those ordinary moments, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, Tish Harrison Warren wrote this beautiful book called Liturgy of the Ordinary that was life-changing for me. I think I've been through it 4 times with different groups of people because it's been so good. And she talks about how it's it's these in between times in our life that actually are the things that are probably more formative to our spiritual life than nothing else. And there are two things that stand out. One is her last chapter is on sleep, and she talks about what an act of surrender it is
Mm.
for us to cease our working and trust that even as we go to sleep, that God is still at work, that we don't have to do all the work,
Right.
right? And it changed my life. I actually have a sign now in my office that says "Give it to God and go to sleep" because of that
Right,
chapter,
right,
right?
right, 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 right.
Um,
Wow. Yeah, that's a beautiful idea. Yeah.
yeah. The other chapter she has is about eating, and she says, we all remember the great, incredible meals that we've had, but those are actually few and far in between. What actually nourishes us are what we eat every day, right? And that's what shapes us. And I think about that in terms of our spiritual lives. It is the day in and the day out engagement, right? With the word, with prayer, just spending time with God, letting Him love me,
Mm.
gathering with other Christians that actually shapes me.
Mm.
Those big moments matter, but what actually forms me is what I do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where disciplines, if for want of a better term, is represented in this book and in John Wesley's idea of capturing grace in our life. And so that's actually the journey we're on. And I think that's probably a really good place for a conversation in a group about what does it look like to see God working in our background, and accepting that I don't have to have big moments all the time, and I don't have to have dramatic representations of God doing something miraculous in my life in order to understand that God, right now, right in these decisions, right in this meal, right in this conversation, right in this event, God is at work in my life, and it's the idea of God being engaged in the background of our life journey. So that's the conversation we want to bring people to, um, and
You know,
uh, and move into that place. Yeah.
as you say that, I'm thinking about, like when a house gets built, so much of the work happens underground and
Mm.
you don't see it. It feels like nothing's
Right.
happening. And then all of a sudden they put the walls up in a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but all that underground work requires moving rocks and moving stones and all of
Mm.
that. And
Mm.
I wonder if there isn't grace in the fact that God does so much of the work in our lives in the background where we're not
Right.
as aware of it.
Absolutely. That's the
Because it
joy.
might be more painful if he did
Yes.
it in the foreground,
Yeah.
right?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what becomes so important for us to engage with that, right? To recognize it's happening and not resist it, or not think there's some goal I have to achieve in this moment, or how do I get the better of what I'm supposed to be accomplishing in these moments. But it's just
Right.
engaging with God, being aware that God is with us, and that for me
Absolutely.
has been the liberty to be able to just say, yeah, God's working with me right now, and whether it's victory or failure, God is engaged with me. That's the conversation people are invited into right now. And if you need some helpful questions to advance that conversation, we'll pop them up on the screen following this. You might need to come back to the video to see them, or just look at your book. But they're there, and you can use those questions. But the main thing we're trying to get at is, let's talk about what it means that God is at work in the background. This has been awesome. Thanks for being with us. Thank you for Janet for sharing some of those thoughts with us and me personally. It's been wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks.